Specifying the folder path. So far in our files, whenever we've needed to reference an external file, we've always just used the file name. And this is working for our project because we're just putting all of our files inside the same folder. But sometimes files will be in another folder and we need to specify how to get to that folder. There's two ways to do this. The first one is absolute paths. These paths start with the root of the file system. On Linux and Mac, this is the beginning of all the files. On Windows, this is the beginning of each drive, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the absolute path name specifies each folder from the root to where that file exists. It clearly specifies where the file is located on that computer. Here's an example. Say we have in the root directory a folder called Thai, and inside of that a folder called docs, and inside of that a folder called catering, and in there we have a file ctcatering.html. This is the absolute path name to that file. It'll specify how to get to that file no matter where the file we're referencing it is located on the drive. With Windows, as I mentioned, we have the problem of drive letters, and so there's a way of describing this in the path name, and that's after the slash we put the drive letter and then the vertical pipe, which is the character holding the shift key down just above the enter key. And that specifies the drive letter. On Windows, each drive has its own drive letter and has its own root within that. So in this case, the Thai folder is on E drive, and this path would specify how to get to that. Absolute path names are rather cumbersome, and they'll break if we move our files to another computer or even another location on the same computer. So a better way to do this is to use relative paths. Here you'll notice that our path name does not start with a slash. The slash represents the root of the file system. In this case, we have folder 1, folder 2, file, assuming that folder 1 is in the same folder as the file that we're referencing this file. If we were referencing an external file that was in a folder called catering in the same folder where our file is, then we could specify it by just saying catering / ctcatering.html. No slash at the beginning. That means that the catering folder is in the same folder as the file that we're referencing from. As I've mentioned so far, we've just given the file name, and that's because all of the files are in the same folder, and therefore the relative path name to all of those files is just their file name, because that assumes that it's in the same folder as the referencing file. Sometimes we need to go back a level in the directory. We're inside of a folder and we need to get back out of it and into another folder. In that case, we can use ... to go back one folder or directory. So if our file's in a folder next to the folder catering, we can go back one folder and then into catering and then get the file we need. Relative path names are really the way to go. But sometimes we want to change what that relative path name is relative to, instead of the directory where the current file is. We can do this with the base element added to the head section of the document. The base element can take an href attribute with the new location of the base directory which relative paths should be relative to. So it will change where those relative paths open. It won't affect any absolute path names that you have in your HTML document. The base tag can also take a target attribute, as we'll talk about later on. The base tag is not commonly used in web pages, but every now and then you will see it, and this way you'll know what it's doing. In the next video, we'll look at how to link to locations within a file rather than just other files.